We recently explored the history and hospitality of Historic Garden Week. Today, we're looking at what sustains it. I'm continuing my conversation with the folks at Historic Garden Week to discuss stewardship, long-term preservation, and how the funds raised during the event are translated into meaningful, lasting work. Deneen, Brannock, and Candy Crosby join me to talk about why preservation requires patience, why fellowships and education matter just as much as restoration, and how projects like the renewal of the Kent-Valentine House grounds reflect a philosophy of care that extends beyond a single season. If part one was about beauty and anticipation, part two is about responsibility and the legacy being quietly shaped year after year. Enjoy. Welcome to Grandma's Silver, where tradition meets today. I'm Allie, your host of the Grandma's Silver podcast and founder of the Grand Millennial Lifestyle. Here, we blend aesthetics with nostalgia, engaging in conversations with lifestyle brands, designers, and more to rediscover the timeless charm of the past. Join me as we journey from home to heart, illuminating the past and polishing the present with the gleam of Grandma's Silver. Well, I'm really excited to launch in today's conversation because this is something of a part two with Historic Garden Week and the Garden Club of Virginia. For those who have not yet heard the part one episode, please go listen to that. You can certainly listen to this as a standalone, but part one will provide a bit of context for today's conversation. And today's guests, we have Deneen, Brannock, and Candy Crosby. So I would love to just let the two of you introduce yourselves so folks have a bit of your background. And also because there are two of you, I think it will help listeners identify your voice to your name.
Certainly. Hi, I'm Deneen Brannock, and I am the current chairman of the Garden Club of Virginia's Restoration Committee, and I am with the Augusta Garden Club in Stanton, Virginia.
Good morning, Candy Crosby. I am the chairman of the Fellowship Committee, which is a subcommittee of the Restoration Committee of the Garden Club of Virginia, and I'm a member of the Albemarle Garden Club, which is in Charlottesville, Virginia.
Are these garden clubs under the larger Garden Club of Virginia? How does this work?
Yeah, they are affiliated. They're member clubs affiliated with the Garden Club of Virginia. We have members from across the state, which makes it dynamic and fascinating and fun. So,
all right. Well, today's conversation, we kind of used part one to explain what Historic Garden Week is, why it has this enduring legacy, what people can look forward to. But I think if we're going to continue almost like that legacy conversation, a big part of that is why Historic Garden Week is important to the state of Virginia. And so I think today our focus is really on stewardship and impact. And we even have a little bit of a case study to talk about with the Kent-Valentine House. And so I'd love to open with a bit of a conversation surrounding support.
The restoration program through the Garden Club of Virginia is one of its most lasting legacies and, just a pillar of what the Garden Club of Virginia has done for nearly 100 years. The Restoration Committee was established in 1929 to formalize our work in preserving and restoring historic landscapes and gardens across the state. Since that time, we've completed over 129 restorations at more than 50 different public sites across Virginia. So again, that's just this tremendous body of work and an ongoing legacy of the GCV. At its most basic, the fact that early on in 1929, the Garden Club of Virginia created Historic Garden Week to specifically fund these restorations, and then eventually our fellowship program. And I like to think that this legacy of work for nearly 100 years weaves this vast garden path across Virginia, stopping in at some of our most historic places and hidden historic gems.
Why does thinking long-term about preservation matter?
I think that's actually the goal of preservation, right? Yeah. Protecting a resource, be it a home, a building, or a landscape for future generations, and to tell its story. That's the essence of preservation. And in the preservation field, we often hear the term sense of place a great deal. And preservation should, at its basic entity, reinforce the sense of place of a property. or a site and reflect the unique character and contribution to history there. And I feel that that's what the amazing thing about the Restoration Committee and our projects. We've contributed to preserving just a great and vast, diverse range of historic sites across the state.
If we're talking about 1929, Historic Garden Week obviously is now its own storied history. What makes it an effective model for all of this?
I think it allows people to see, beautiful homes, beautiful gardens, historic sites, and get inspiration from those. And that is, in some ways, how historic sites got ideas. People traveled, or they saw pattern books, or they saw lithographs of images of, gardens in Europe, and they recreated them at their sites, 100, 200 years ago. And so having Historic Garden Week tours is similar to that. People travel and they see these wonderful sites, and they can take that inspiration and implement it in their own backyard if they want to, or just enjoy it. So,
Yeah.
Candy, what do you think?
Well, I was going to say, let's not forget the fun. I mean, the
Yeah.
fabulous fun of packing a picnic basket, getting in the car, and driving around the beautiful Virginia countryside and seeing these lovely gardens, historic homes, and everybody's happy during Garden Week. I mean, everyone works very hard to prepare, but come the day, it's just a lot of joy, a lot of fun.
Lots of opportunities to go to many sites and on many tours.
The biggest house party in the country, right, Karen? I think you referred to it that way. And it is. It's just a ton of fun.
I love that. Speaking of stewardship, because obviously the fundraising aspect is one very big, very important part of all of this, but there's also fellowships.
I always hope that people understand what a fellowship is, what a fellow is. It's a scholarship, a grant of money given to a student to do research. We're celebrating our 30th anniversary this year. Started in 1996. It was named in honor, the first one was named in honor of Rudy Favretti, who was a landscape architect from Connecticut, who was the landscape architect for the Garden Club of Virginia at that time. The second fellowship was named for William Riley, who was our landscape architect for, 21 years or so. So we have two, and they alternate between years. One year is the Favretti, the next year is the Favretti. It's a generous grant, $10,000, with housing provided. Travel incidentals like that are covered by the fellowship. As I said, Deneen is the head of the Restoration Committee, and it's a subcommittee of that committee. On the committee, we have professionals from in the area of historic preservation who help us administer it. So we have the knowledge of these really remarkable professionals. Jack Geary, who's Colonial Williamsburg Director of Archaeology, they help. These people help with the selection of the student who will receive the grant. Peter Hatch, who is a gardener, historian of Charlottesville, Virginia, wrote the wonderful book on Thomas Jefferson's garden at Monticello. Calder Law, who is retired as a senior architectural historian at the Virginia Department of Historic Resources in Richmond. Nicholas Lucchetti, who is the principal investigator and archaeologist at James River Institute for Archaeology. And Peggy Cornett, who is the curator of plants at Monticello. In addition to that stellar group of professionals, we have members of the Garden Club of Virginia, Deneen, of course, the president of the Garden Club of Virginia, and other members who serve on the committee. We'll be meeting April 1st this spring to select our fellow for this year. And I want to point out too, because I think so that people understand that the fellowship is not just for a graduate student in historic preservation. They can also be studying simply architecture, landscape or architectural history, archaeology, anthropology, history, or horticulture. So that widens the net, widens the field of who can apply for the scholarship. What else, Deneen? What am I missing?
I think it's important to know that this is, these are scholarly research papers that are
Right.
developed, and
Yes, absolutely.
they become a resource for other people doing research.
Oh, yeah.
They're stored not only on our website, but Candy, you can give the other places.
Well, hard copies are made for the owners of the property whose site we're researching that year. This year, for example, a copy went down to the College of William and Mary to the swim library. The site was in that neighborhood, in that vicinity. Stacy Catron, who is down at the Cherokee Library in Atlanta, it goes to her institution. The Cherokee Library is a history, they do a lot of history of gardens there. It goes to the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. It goes to the Library of Virginia, Kent-Valentine House, our headquarters, Garden Club Virginia headquarters gets a copy. And as Deneen mentioned, the website, the archive, there are 32 reports posted. They're just an amazing free archive of all these histories of it's a history of Virginia in these reports, actually. Fascinating. And they're 150 pages, some are 100 pages. There are site plans, there are plant lists. It's just a remarkable archive. For the history buff, if you get into it, you can't stop reading it.
The fellowship program, I think, was developed sort of as a complement to the restoration projects that we do, because there's no way the GCV could restore every significant public garden or landscape in the state. And we can't even research every one. But by doing research on different properties, it sort of builds a nice complement to the actual work in garden restoration that we do.
Right. This just popped in my head. One student wrote in her paper several years ago, they're so important because you never know when that historic, beautiful house down the street, down the road, in the next county is going to be knocked down and gone and developed into apartment houses or something. So this record preserves the memory of that place. Our committee, the fellowship committee, as I said, has these amazing professionals who serve on the committee. They all have encyclopedic knowledge of the historic sites in Virginia and the hidden gems, the houses that no one knows about that are in private ownership. We meet and gather those names and figure out with their help which of these sites would be a possible fellowship site. Most often, the owners are thrilled to be the subject of study of a fellowship because it's getting a history made of your house, your historic house. So that's how we choose them. And we have, oh my gosh, in Virginia, there are a lot of historic houses. We have a wealth of places to choose from, but I don't want to make it sound like it's really easy to select one and decide on one and to find one sometimes.
Almost probably makes it harder.
Yeah.
You have such a list.
So we basically pick the site and develop the focus to a certain extent of the fellowship, what they need to research and provide in their paper.
So, you're listing that on your selection committee, you have a great variety, but I heard archaeology a number of times. I heard horticulture. I heard landscape backgrounds. So what is the benefit of enmeshing all of those backgrounds?
I think it's because all those components are involved in a historical site. Horticulture, if it is an historical house, garden around the house, garden design, history, archaeology, what's under the ground, that's super important, as you know. All of those components make up the big picture.
They're all related fields that can provide information and inform people about a historic property.
How does the research that comes out of the fellowship impact your work?
We've had a few fellowships, I believe, and Candy can chime in here, that were at some of our restoration garden sites, but for the most part, they're not. They're separate sites, and some of them are private. So obviously, and we didn't talk about this, but for the Garden Club of Virginia to do a restoration garden or landscape, a site has to be open to the public. And so typically, it could be a private entity, but they have to be open to the public. It's not a private home where we do garden and restorations. So, but the fellowships have often been private residences.
The majority are private residents.
But I think it's not so much but how they impact the restoration work, it's that they complement them in building this body of information about historic landscapes and sites across the state. And we are also doing garden restorations at historic landscapes and sites.
Right. And another point is they're not all houses, not all
Right.
historic homes. For example, one study, which I love, is the George Washington Masonic National Memorial in Alexandria, Virginia, which I used to drive by on the school bus every day when I was a kid and was fascinated by this building because it's this enormous pyramidal structure on top of the biggest hill in Alexandria. That's a great study. Another one is the Western State Hospital, Deneen in Stanton,
Mhm.
Virginia.
Exactly.
That was a study. That was the asylum for the state of Virginia, wasn't it?
It was
Yeah,
the second institution for the care of the mentally ill. Yeah, the first was in Williamsburg. So, yeah.
right. So the majority are houses, historic houses, but there are a few. Blandy Farm in Winchester, Clark County, which was kind of a different fellowship. We did it in an interim period when we didn't have a landscape architect, and it still is a very solid history of the site, and it provided a trail map or a trail study for Blandy. But that's not really what we do, although that's a very fine study. It was just done in a kind of interim period, supervised by a professor at the University of Virginia and folks at Blandy. That's our state arboretum, Blandy Farm.
The grant is awarded annually, but is the research project itself also a 1 year research project? Or do they extend beyond a year?
They don't extend beyond a year. No, student selected in April, arrives in Virginia late May, early June, resides in Virginia at the site, in the housing provided, does their research. They go back to school because they're still a master's student in graduate school. Our hope is to have the paper by the end of the year, and sometimes it can go over that because it's a lot of work to write a 150-page
Yeah.
paper.
It's a summer fellowship, basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is a fellowship program and it does research at sites. The restoration landscape program does landscape restorations. There's been a little bit of overlap, like I said, but they're separate.
But certainly they inform our knowledge.
Fellowships are this great public resource once
That's
they're
right.
completed. As far as our landscape restoration program, sometimes the fellowship committee members, because they are so involved in the field of historic preservation and architecture and historic landscapes, they might have ideas for potential restoration sites, but that's not typically how we get restoration projects.
How do you typically get restoration projects?
So that is a process. The Restoration Committee receives applications from property owners or organizations, owning historic sites that would like to apply to be a restoration garden site. And they fill out an application, and then the Restoration Committee reviews that application, often in consultation with our landscape architect. They have to meet certain criteria and align with the mission and values of the Garden Club of Virginia. But first and foremost, they have to be open to the public and they have to demonstrate the ability to maintain the investment of, the garden gift.
You mentioned criteria. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. It doesn't have to be wildly technical, but just kind of what sorts of things determine what. I don't like to necessarily use the phrase like deserves investment, right? Because they all do. But how are you narrowing that down?
Each application and review is individual. I wouldn't say that we have a defined list, but basically, the site needs to be a historic site. There should probably be some evidence or inclination that there was a historic landscape there. Again, it has to be open to the public. They have to be able to demonstrate that they can maintain and support the restoration landscape that's being given as a gift to the property. They're all so different and so unique. It's really hard to say, you have to check this box.
So, if we're talking about restoration projects, one question that I did have was how the frequency, and perhaps that varies based on the intensity or level of restoration required for a project. And then also if you wanted to provide perhaps specific examples of what some of those projects have looked like.
Sure. Candy and I are chuckling because the Restoration Committee is incredibly busy right now. We have a number of projects going on, and that's not always typical, I will say. We don't do a project every year because obviously a major landscape project takes a while to develop. A lot of factors go into that. So, you've got a process for planning and design and construction documents and civil engineering and survey work. So all of that takes a great deal of time. And then you actually get to construction and implementation, which can take months as well. So projects can range in time depending on the complexity and size. Right now, we do have several major projects going on, which we can talk about later. But as I mentioned earlier, if you look at the list of our past projects, we have done work at so many iconic historic places across Virginia, from Mount Vernon, Montpelier, Monticello, to, smaller places that are lesser known historic places like a church in Fincastle that was the gateway to the West in the early 18th century, as well as more, those are sort of the early ones, or, like Bruton Parish. But, we also have places like Gary Melcher's home and studio in Fredericksburg that is, a 19th century house, but of a wonderful artist. So, projects can range greatly in their historic associations as well as character. If we want to look back at the past restoration projects, I think you had asked, that capture the spirit of the work of the Restoration Committee. There are many that do. Of course, Monticello, where we've engaged in projects since the beginning, since before the committee began, and really for almost the past 100 years. Stratford Hall on the northern neck of Virginia, which was the home of two signers of the Declaration of Independence, the Lee brothers. We've had several major projects there early on in the 1930s, and then more recently, we finished up a project there in 2020, Thomas Jefferson's Poplar Forest, which is in Forest, Virginia, just outside of Lynchburg. Poplar Forest was Thomas Jefferson's second home. It was his retreat house. He called it his Villa Retreat. It's along the same lines of architectural style as Monticello, but smaller and more personal in scale. It's an octagonal house with a Palladian design that actually incorporated landscape in that conception of the Palladian design. And that was just this wonderful partnership where the Foundation for Jefferson's Poplar Forest worked with us, and they undertook extensive archaeology. And then our landscape architect at the time, Will Riley, used that documentation as well as documents from Thomas Jefferson on his garden design to recreate and fully restore the landscape to Jefferson's design. And it was a multi-phase project over several years that included a mulberry tree alley, spiral clumps of trees and shrubs flanking the house, replanting of oval beds with historic roses, and an extensive recreation of the beautiful stone circular carriage turnaround, all of which, in true Jefferson fashion, complemented the architecture and geometry of the house and Jefferson's broader landscape plan. And so the level of research and accuracy in that project was just amazing. The full scale of what a restoration project can be. And it truly, and additionally, I think it's important to know that the restoration work typically enhances the character of these historic sites. And that's important. And I think that's a perk for us, in giving this gift to a historic site. We want to know that it's helped them as a property in their interpretation and their visitorship. So I feel like that was just a wonderful example in partnership.
I'm glad you chose that one, Deneen, because that is a fascinating example of landscape elements forming the picture of that property. As you pointed out, the mulberry alleys, the mounds, catalpa trees and locust trees, and they're mounds, and they look like little hills in the middle of the landscape, but they were made that way. Jefferson had the mulberry trees because they provide instant shade. they grow so fast, and they have this shade that it would shade his study in the summer. Very hot down in Bedford County in the summertime. So that's a great example. That's a really beautiful, that's maybe one of my favorites.
Now, Deneen, you mentioned enhancing character, which brings us to the Kent-Valentine House.
Uh-huh. Sure.
So, could we talk a little bit about what the Kent-Valentine House is and why updating the grounds felt necessary and why it's symbolic? Let's just have a conversation about what's going on there.
Certainly, certainly. Well, it is one of our major projects right now. We have been working on the design and are getting close to, negotiating with the contractor, but it started, I guess, because the GCVs maintained this beautiful landscape setting around the Kent-Valentine House since purchasing the property in, the 1970s. And several of our landscape architects over the years revised plans and implemented various updates. However, the GCV board and the restoration committee have a strong commitment to conservation and promoting responsible horticultural practices. So, the existing landscape has a great deal of English ivy. And while effective and attractive in many ways as a ground cover, ivy can be invasive. So, in the process of re-envisioning the landscape to remove the ivy and working with our new landscape architect, Nelson Bird Waltz out of Charlottesville, we wanted to create a space that was inviting to visitors and our members and staff, and to invite them to explore and enjoy the setting of the setting around this remarkable house. It's an incredible new design that will create a formal lawn panel edged with shrubs and perennials in the front to complement the character of the house. And then along the side of the house, the west side, there'll be a garden path with interpretive elements to talk about sort of the geography and the ecology of the area around Richmond, which is the fall line. We sort of call the project a botanical meeting ground where, at the fall line where the coastal plain meets the middle section of the state and the mountains, we're using that to interpret native and state ecology and horticulture. And so along the side of the house, we'll have those interpretive elements as well as seating areas. Then around back, we're regrading and creating a rain garden to help with water retention. And we are redoing the entire parking area to make it more ADA accessible, as well as better designed for traffic flow and events, because we can stage events in that back area. So the goal is to create this wonderful new inviting and welcoming space that's beautiful and educational, but also functional for our members and guests and events.
You might have mentioned it and I might have missed it, but this is the Garden Club's headquarters, this property.
One of the greenest spots, if not the greenest spot in the city of Richmond.
Yeah, we have a wonderful tree canopy that doesn't exist at most downtown Richmond sites.
It's because it functions as this headquarters and is somewhat symbolic of the work that you're doing. How did that sort of conversation have to impact at all the aesthetic?
The mission of the Garden Club of Virginia absolutely was the founding basis for informing the design. And just to quickly state our mission, it's to conserve the gifts of nature, to restore and preserve historic landscapes of the Commonwealth, to cultivate the knowledge and love of gardening, and to lead future generations to build on this heritage. As I described the project, I think it meets all of those tenets of our mission. And in fact, we have a brick sidewalk that leads from the front of Franklin Street to the front porch. And one of the features in the new garden will be an inscribed panel with the Garden Club of Virginia's mission on it, so that people automatically see that if they enter the garden. But yes, it'll be educational. It will be hopefully inspiring to people walking by, to visitors, and educational, as far as the horticultural examples that are on display. We hope to, inspire future generations who walk through those gates.
It's an urban classroom, for the city. And as Deneen said, the people walking by walk in and learn something. It's going to be really neat when it's done.
And it's always open for Historic Garden Week. It won't be completed this spring, but hopefully by 2027, and we can really celebrate the new garden being open for Historic Garden Week.
You have the unique position of being involved at the leadership level in all of this. What inspired you personally to get involved at this level?
I think on a personal level, my background is in historic preservation. And so being a member of the garden club, my local garden club and the Garden Club of Virginia, I was always particularly interested in the restoration landscape program. And so I was fortunately asked to be on the committee, and it's just been an honor to serve as chair the past 2 years. And we have such a great committee, and the restoration committee, unlike the fellowship committee, the restoration committee is made up of all Garden Club of Virginia members, meaning they are members of garden clubs from across the state. And we actually have a wide representation of people on the committee from across the state with various backgrounds. The Garden Club of Virginia as a whole is made up of incredibly talented, smart, productive, hardworking women. So anytime you get a group like that together, you're going to accomplish a lot. So it's an honor to work with everyone on the committee. I think that really elevates everything we do. Everyone can rally around, our restoration projects and be supportive and take the message of what we're doing back to their part of the state.
When I was a kid, growing up in Alexandria, Virginia, my father's idea of Sunday fun was to take a drive in the country. So we would go outside, Northern Virginia down to Warrenton, Fauquier County, all these beautiful places that part of the countryside that have beautiful old homes. And as a kid sitting in the back seat, I'd see those old houses on hills and I go, wow, this is beautiful here. This is so neat. And I grew up to be a gardener and live in an old house, not a grand old house, but an old house. So this is just my cup of tea to be volunteering on the fellowship committee. And we're training the next generation of preservationists and landscape architects and archaeologists, horticulturists, whoever is in the fellowship. That's just a very satisfying feeling, and I feel so lucky to have this opportunity.
And you hit on my next question, which was fellowship related, because the next generation of preservationists. What are you hoping programs like the fellowship program, even the restoration projects, people being intrigued by it all, learning from it all, what are you hoping these help to cultivate long term?
We hope they go into the field of historic preservation or take advantage of the opportunity to work with our landscape architect and be inspired by that. And as I said, go out and have that dream for themselves.
Overall, we hope that this develops a respect for and knowledge of Virginia's historic sites and culture and deepens that understanding of how the landscape always played an important role, from kitchen and ornamental gardens to terraced landforms that, on the river that aided commerce and social connections. Virginia has this rich tapestry of history that reflects the founding of our nation. And, in this 250th year, we're thrilled to be able to embrace that and to have preserved a big piece of that. It's also important to recognize, I think, that history is complex. We can respect the time and place of historic sites, again, that sense of place and how they contributed to daily life and those who live there, while telling the entire story of life, landscape, and multiple cultures over time.
Candy, you touched earlier on the fact that a lot of folks, people come out to see Historic Garden Week for all sorts of reasons, I'm sure, right? One of the reasons it's been so successful is because it's fun and it's beautiful and it's just this joyous time. But is there anything on the legacy that they're helping to sustain that you hope people take away from their experience as well?
Just the exposure to these landscapes and these properties. The historic landscape can easily disappear, as I pointed out earlier, by development and whatever. Population increase, housing. So these are wonderful reminders of our past. And Deneen said it well, just what she said about how we hope exposure to these places of our past will inspire people to continue to support our preservation efforts and go out and make their own preservation efforts. If you just take away the idea that historic preservation is a good idea, well, we've won the day right there. You know?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, just to follow up on that, the goal is that they come and they have this wonderful experience on a tour, see these beautiful sites, whether they're new or old, because not all places on tour for Historic Garden Week are old, but they're beautiful sites nonetheless. And they can be inspired by them, but also to know that by buying that ticket and going on that tour, they are supporting this 90 plus year legacy of preserving Virginia's cultural and historic landscapes. And we appreciate that. And we hope that it inspires them to come back again or be more involved. I think it would be great for people to know about our other exciting new project, which is the restoration of the historic bowling green at the Governor's Palace in Colonial Williamsburg.
Oh, okay.
So, would you like to hear a little bit about
I
that?
would love to hear about that.
Okay. So, as I said, the committee is quite busy. And so, in addition to the Kent-Valentine House, last fall we accepted a new project in partnership with Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. And as I mentioned, it's to reestablish, I guess is a better word, the historic bowling green and adjacent orchard next to the beautifully ornate and formal Palace Gardens in Colonial Williamsburg. The gardens and the orchard and the bowling green were designed by Arthur Shercliffe, who is John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s landscape architect for the restoration of Colonial Williamsburg. And so he designed the bowling green nearly 100 years ago. And it was at that time a wonderful educational and recreational space. But over time, it was lost in doing, archaeological research. Colonial Williamsburg obviously knows where it was and knew more details about the space. And so they came to us and requested that we help reestablish and restore that space. So we're in the process of doing that with the goal to have it installed by July 4th for their 250th celebrations. But one of the most unique and I think fascinating parts of this garden restoration is that it was designed by Arthur Shercliffe, who was a renowned early 20th century landscape architect and colonial revival landscape architecture. Because of his work at Colonial Williamsburg, the Garden Club of Virginia hired him to be the landscape architect for some of our earlier projects like Bruton Parish and Stratford Hall and Wilton House. So he did work for the GCV nearly 100 years ago. To be restoring now a site that Arthur Shercliffe did himself sort of brings us full circle in, I think, the realm of GCV's work and landscape preservation. So it's just a fascinating project and a wonderful tie-in to, the quality and legacy of our work, I think, with Shercliffe.
And then throughout our history, we've had renowned landscape architects on our projects. The quality of the work we do is first class and known to be so throughout the world.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. This was just as exciting as part one, and I'm really eager to see all the good work, not only that comes out of Historic Garden Week, but that your projects are contributing to the broader Commonwealth. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your interest.